So we're going to look at this passage, and we're going to find that this passage tells us this, that we care for others in stress with bracing, gospel-grounded words and sacrificial presence. Bracing, gospel-grounded words and sacrificial presence. So let's walk through the passage, and as I like to do, I'm just going to ask questions, and we'll answer it as we go. First question is, how did Paul become anxious for them? What are the circumstances? Well, not too many months before, Paul had been busy on a second missionary journey proclaiming the gospel in modern-day Turkey, heading west from the southeast coast, heading over to what might be modern-day Izmir, but trying to press inland as he went. Back then it was called Asia Minor, and Acts 16 records that as he would try to go somewhere, the Holy Spirit stopped him. We're not told how, except it must have been obvious. And he kind of bounced along, trying to head north until he got to the coastal city of Troy, Troas they called it. And there, as he slept, God gave him a vision, a man dressed in the clothes of Macedonia, beckoning to him to cross the Aegean Sea to a region called Macedonia and to come help. And so Paul did what he was supposed to. He obeyed along with his team, and he traveled to the imperial city of Philippi, and there, Acts 16 tells us, he preached the gospel. He proclaimed the gospel first to a Jewish woman named Lydia, and then to many other people, and people believed. And then there was a riot. There was a mob. Tried to take Paul out, tried to disturb things. Paul and his companions were beaten and jailed. Now God gave them a miraculous release, and we can rejoice in that, but they still had bruises all over their bodies. And after their release, they were asked to leave peacefully, and they did. So they went west along that northern coast of the Aegean to Thessalonica. That's still around Thessaloniki, about 100 miles they traveled, the next major city, a beautiful city. And there he proclaimed the gospel, and people believed, and there was another riot. And this time, as a result of the riot, Paul was not seized, but one of the new Christians was seized, and they had a trial, and they ordered that man to sort of post security money for any future damages caused by the presence of these new Christians in the community. So the man had to put his money up, and Paul decided it was time to leave to protect this man and his money. So he moved on about 50 miles to the west, and he came to the community of Berea, and guess what happened? He proclaimed the gospel, people believed, and once again he had to flee because of the mob. He fled. The believers there in Berea escorted him along the eastern coast of the Balkan Peninsula down to Athens, left him there. He had left Timothy and Silas behind, his team members, and asked that they return to him as soon as possible. 3 churches started, 3 preaching opportunities, 3 churches started, 3 riots, and 3 expulsions or opportunities to flee for his life. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm Paul about this point, I'd be thinking, was that a Macedonian I saw in that vision, or was that somebody else? Maybe I misread this. 3 cities, 3 preaching opportunities, 3 new churches, and 3 mob violence situations. In one case, he was there only a few weeks. Thessalonica, maybe the guesses are 3 weeks to 2 months. And that means that these new Christians, many of whom were Gentiles, whose conversion was profound. They turned to God from idols, Paul said, to serve the living and true God, and to wait for his Son from heaven, Jesus, our deliverer from the wrath to come. The dramatic change in their life was so great that word of their conversion spread throughout that whole region. And so for 2 months, he taught them and trained them, and then he had to flee. Well, the violence there broke out, and it must have continued fiercely. And to Paul, it seemed like that tiny group of very new and very untrained Christians were at the epicenter, the core of opposition to the gospel. They faced fierce, stiff, relentless hatred from the mobs. Paul writes about that. We've heard this. For you, brothers, became imitators of the churches of God in Christ Jesus that are in Judea, for you suffered the same things from your own countrymen as they did from the Jews. So Paul was full of anxious care for them. He yearned to be with them, to support them. He felt torn from them. That's the language he uses. We were torn away from you. He tried to go back to them many, many times. So down in Athens, Timothy and Silas arrived. They were able to get away. They met up with Paul in Athens. They gave him updates on the churches of Macedonia. And Paul, realizing the risks and the dangers to this new band of Christians in Thessalonica, decided he would send Timothy to them. And Timothy goes and comes back and brings a report. Paul's now in Corinth. And in response to that report, he writes this letter. He says his anxious hair was so great that it became unbearable. He had to do something. So those are the circumstances. You would probably understand that. So what is he anxious about? Well, that may seem like an obvious question with an obvious answer, but it isn't. And let me walk through this carefully. Let's start with what Paul is not anxious about. He is not anxious about their pain and suffering. It's not his first concern. Back in the Roman world in those days, life expectancy for a woman was 30 to 35. Men not much older. They lived in pain and suffering. There were no antibiotics, no Tylenol. Pain and suffering was the nature of life. That wasn't Paul's first concern, and I don't think it was a cultural thing. I think Paul saw bigger issues, that he wasn't hard-hearted. He shows a concern for people in sickness in Philippians, but Paul's not primarily about that. Paul is not primarily worried that they are suffering. He's worried about why they are suffering and how they'll respond to their suffering. So yes, they're experiencing great affliction, but he wants to know how they're going to respond. And he knows why they're experiencing it. Well, why are they experiencing this suffering? Paul makes it very clear in this passage. He sees their severe affliction as the work of the enemy, Satan, the tempter. Satan is afflicting them as a way of tempting them. He says, for fear, I sent Timothy for you, for fear that somehow the tempter had tempted you. He saw Satan's hand in this, and that makes sense. Well, what kind of temptation are they facing? Well, I think scholars are right. There are two here, not just one. The one seems obvious, the second less obvious. The less obvious one is in the presence of these enemies of the gospel, they were tempted to abandon their loyalty to Paul. The enemies of the gospel were going to try to sever their relationship with Paul, their father in the faith. Well, how are they going to do that? Well, it's very simple. You just say to the Thessalonians, you know that Paul? He sure didn't hang around long when the going got tough. You know why? He's a con artist. He's a traveling televangelist. He's a huckster. He's an opportunist. He was in it for the money. He was in it to get a following. And now as soon as things get tough for you, where is he? He's nowhere to be found. You know what he's like, don't you? Well, that's why Paul defends his character at the beginning of chapter 2, because they were undermining his character and his integrity. That's the less obvious temptation. The other one's pretty obvious. They were tempted because they were facing the constant question of, at what price am I willing to follow Christ? At what price am I willing to follow Christ? Was there a price so high that they would trade their profession of allegiance to Jesus for peace and prosperity? That's always the goal with persecution. It's always the tempter's goal, to come between people and the messengers of the gospel, to come between people and Jesus by making them compare the cost of following Jesus with the promises of a better life that he can give them. Here's how Paul said it. I sent to learn about your faith for fear that somehow the tempter had tempted you and our labor should be in vain. Well, that's an interesting way to say it, isn't it? So somehow the tempter tempt you and our labor be in vain. What does he mean my labor would be in vain? What does that mean? I mean, I thought once saved, always saved. That's the phrase I heard for years and years. Is Paul saying they could lose their salvation? Is that what's going on here? Why does he say my labor would be in vain? No, Paul is not saying people can lose their salvation. What he is saying is that professed faith is proven to be genuine faith in trials. Professed faith is proven to be genuine faith in trials. Well, that's an odd thing to say. Maybe for some of you that's new. Where did Paul get that? Well, he got it from Jesus. You might remember Jesus told parables in Matthew 13 and same one in Luke. I believe in Mark, he tells a parable of the sower that goes out sowing the seed, and there are 4 kinds of soil. And the first soil, seed never takes root. The evil one comes and plucks it away. But there are 3 left, and only one of them bears fruit. The other 2 don't bear fruit. In one case, the second soil, there's fruit, apparent fruit, until there is suffering for the gospel. Jesus put it this way, when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately they fall away. You see, at what price will you abandon Christ? Oh, this is too hard. I'm done with Jesus. Tribulation, persecution, they fall away. And the third soil, they fall away because of greed and love of this world and love of comfort. The cares of this world, say Jesus, and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. Only one endures, the fourth soil. Only one persists and bears fruit. And Paul is saying that professed faith is found to be true faith as it endures trial. Now that may be, maybe not, I hope not, but that may be a whole new idea for some of you. Because if you're my age, maybe a little younger, maybe others as well. We've lived in an American context where for the last 50 or more years, we become accustomed to thinking that conversion is counting decisions and people praying a prayer. And we're very quick to say to somebody, oh, you've received Christ, you're a Christian. And the problem with that is Paul never did that. He never left Philippi and sent a letter back to Antioch saying, hey, we had 28 decisions for Christ today. Well, why didn't he do that? Because he believed that professed faith is proven to be true faith and how it endures trial. He believed there were 2 soils that received the word immediately with joy, but under trial or tempted by comfort, abandoned the Jesus they said they believed. Why did Paul get that idea? Why does Jesus say that? Why does this idea that true faith endures? Well, again, they got it from the Bible. And so what the Bible teaches is not once saved, always saved. The Bible teaches true faith endures. We call it the perseverance of the saints.